Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's live virtual streaming event with Michael Punke, author of The Revenant. My name is Polly Reynolds and I'm the head of Adult Services and Archives. We're wrapping up our 2020 virtual programming series. I just wanted to mention one of our events, Wednesday, December 2nd. David S. Brown, author of The Last American Aristocrat, The Brilliant Life and Improbable Education of Henry Adams, who's considered to be a literary icon and one of America's most prominent writers and intellectuals of his era. That wraps up our 2020 season, but stay tuned for 2021. We have a very exciting lineup of speakers that you don't want to miss. You can register and view a list of all of our upcoming programs at hudsonlibrary.org or sign up for our email newsletter to get our latest updates. Just a few short details about tonight's events. Down below at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A box. If you'd like to ask the speaker a question, just type your question into the Q&A and we will get to those questions as time permits. If you're interested in purchasing Mr. Punke's book, we're also providing a link in the chat to the Learned Owl bookstore. I am now going to turn it over to tonight's moderator, Basil Musnoff, the president of the Hudson Library and Historical Society Board of Trustees, who will be introducing tonight's speaker. Take it away, Basil.
Thanks, Polly. Tonight, it's really a great pleasure to introduce to all of you Michael Punke. Mike and I go back a long way. We were very close friends together in law school. In fact, really from the first day we arrived there. We've tried to remain in touch through the years. Sometimes sometimes we do that better than others, but still good friends. And I'd like to thank Mike. You know, when COVID first hit, it really looked like we needed to step up our virtual programming. In light of that, the first person I reached out to was Mike, and he eagerly accepted our invitation to be here. So thanks, Mike. Mike is from Torrington, Wyoming, and it's that upbringing there that led him to focus his writing primarily on the history of the West. You know him as the author of The Revenant, which is the best-selling novel that was made into an Oscar-nominated movie and won for Leonardo DiCaprio his Best Actor award. In addition to being a successful author, however, Mike has had really an amazing career in international law and as a diplomat. His interest in international law started from the very beginning, focusing on that at George Washington University, then came to Cornell Law School, where he was editor-in-chief of the Cornell International Law Journal. And after a lot, I'm going to gloss over these, Mike, because it's so much to say in your resume that we could take the hour on that. But he worked for Senator Max Baucus on international trade issues. From there to the Clinton White House, where he worked for a number of years, then into the private sector before taking a little hiatus to write a few books. The Revenant, of course, and a couple of nonfiction history books. But then soon the outside world came calling again, and in 2009, President Obama appointed Mike as United States ambassador to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, where he served for during the Obama administration. Today, he serves as vice president of public policy and web services for a small little upstart company called Amazon. And somewhere along the line, he found some time to write another book that's due to come out next summer. So, Mike, welcome to Hudson Library in Hudson, Ohio.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm super excited to be here, and it's fun to do this with you, Basil.
Thanks. And everybody out there, please do send in questions that you might have for Mike as we go along. Obviously, it's a varied writing career and a varied career outside of writing. So I'm sure there's lots of things you might want to ask him. So let's start with the Revenant.
Sure.
That's the kind of the book that puts you on the map. Your first book, and thanks to the movie, the one that you're most have the most notoriety for. So how did you go from this career in the law and international politics to writing this book?
Well, I've always been interested in writing, and I've always been interested in Western American history. And when I was working in Washington D.C. after law school, I went to Washington, and as you mentioned, ended up in government. And I really enjoyed my time in government. But after my government stint in the Clinton administration was over, I ended up practicing law in a private law firm. And without casting aspersions on you, Basil, or anybody else who's happy in the career of law, I think it's safe to say that I was not happy in the career of law, at least practicing as an attorney. And I started kind of plotting alternative ways to make a living. And I also was very eager to get back to the West and live in the West again, which is where I grew up. And I kind of imagined this as my sort of Shawshank Redemption moment, where I started chiseling through the wall with the hand tools. And my version of that was I decided I would try and write a book. And so I started getting up early in the morning, working on this book that became The Revenant. And after a number of years was able to finish that. And when it sold, I kind of used that as my opportunity to leave the law firm practice behind and move back west again, and which is where I've been ever since, with the exception of the years that I was in Geneva.
Excellent. And while you were in Washington, you actually managed to find a Montana girl to get you back
I
west.
did. Ironically, went all the way to Washington, D.C. to meet a girl from Montana, and then we had a long discussion between us about Wyoming versus Montana as a place to live, and we ended up in Montana, and I've never been unhappy about that.
All right. Well, you kind of glossed over some details that I want to talk to you about. You said you started writing this book, early in the morning, a few hours a day, but at some point you had to get the idea for this book, Hugh Glass, story of Hugh Glass. How did you come to want to write that?
Well, it's a bit of an embarrassing story in that The Revenant is not the first book that I started to write. When I first decided I would try and write a book, I decided that I would write a novel that was kind of loosely based on what I was doing, a young person working in government in Washington, D.C., and experiencing the rough and tumble of Washington, D.C. And after working on that book for about a year, so not a small amount of time, I showed it to a couple of friends whose opinion I respected, who knew a little bit about writing. And the verdict I got back on that book is that it was badly written and boring. And that was especially painful because that was the fictionalized version of my life. So I felt like there was some sort of double-edged criticism there, but I was smart enough to abandon that project entirely. But it was right after that sort of painful confrontation that I was reading a historical book about the fur trade. And in that book about the fur trade, I came across these two paragraphs about this guy named Hugh Glass, who had been mauled by a grizzly bear, abandoned and robbed by his comrades, crawled 200 miles back to the last edge of civilization, survived, re-equipped himself, and then went out to seek revenge. And I thought, you know what? That's a much more interesting story than mine. And so that's when I started working on The Revenant.
Well, at least your friends didn't tell you the main character of your first book was unlikable.
They did not quite say that. There were things I might have read between the lines.
So how did you? Okay, so The Revenant is telling a historical story, something that actually happened, but it's subtitled A Novel of Revenge. So it's fictionalized but historical. Yep. How did you work that?
Well, I have a fairly strong view about what historical fiction, at least the historical fiction that I write, should do. And I feel pretty strongly that it should be as historically accurate as possible. And I say that, and there are certainly are moments where I'm not above taking liberties for the purpose of narrative. But as a general matter, I work really hard for the historical fiction books that I write to be accurate. And I certainly don't want readers to get a significant misimpression about the broad strokes of historical events. And so it is fiction, but hopefully it rings true even to somebody who knows the history of that era as a version of the story that's plausible. One of the things that I really loved about The Revenant and the story of Hugh Glass, and one of the things that I looked for in coming up with the subject for this new book that I just have finished, is I love historical stories where we kind of know the bones of the story, kind of the major mileposts, but we really don't know what happens in between those mileposts. And so there's just huge space to imagine what's in between. And when it comes to the story of Hugh Glass, there literally is about 2 paragraphs of history, actual recorded history of his story. So we know he was with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. We know he was mauled by a grizzly bear. We know he was abandoned by his comrades. We know he crawls back and survives. We know he went out to seek revenge. We know in broad strokes what happens when he encounters his betrayers. But in between all those things, there's virtually no historical record. We don't know how he survived. We don't know what he was thinking in terms of how angry he was at being betrayed, or how he decided to forgive or not to forgive. And to me, that's the perfect space for historical fiction, because you can tell a story that's historically accurate and has that additional drama and just kind of vibrancy that I think comes from being real. But there's really room there for a novelist to fill in the blanks in between. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of story that I like. By contrast, I've done a couple of nonfiction books based on historical incidents. And for those books, I tried to find incidents where there's a massive historical record. And where, so for example, I wrote a book about a town in Montana called Butte, a mining disaster that took place in Montana in 1917. And Butte, Montana in 1917 had 6 daily newspapers that were covering this mine disaster. And so in addition to all the other types of historical records, you had 6 newspapers doing saturation coverage of this event. And so there was a wealth of historical materials, even, dialogue that I could draw from newspaper interviews with some of the participants. That to me was the perfect story for nonfiction, because the historical record was so rich.
Yeah. And for our people in our audience who aren't familiar with that particular book, it's called Fire and Brimstone. And it's a really fascinating history of the Butte mining disaster, mine fire in 1917, World War I era. So I encourage, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit after we
sure.
Finish with a couple other things, but it is really terrific. Did you anything out there that you really went out on a limb on historically? Like, I know that there's a part where he kind of encounters pirates.
There is historical support for, so the main character in The Revenant is this guy, Hugh Glass, who's a real person. And at the time that I was doing the research on this book, there was only one biography written about Hugh Glass, and it's by a guy named John Myers Myers, and was written, I think, in the 60s. And John Myers Myers, as you can kind of tell from his name, is a bit of a character. And so he presents his book as nonfiction, but there probably is a good deal of lore built into his supposed nonfiction rendition of Hugh Glass's life, he does claim, and supposedly there is some historical record for this, that Hugh Glass in his background was a mariner, and while serving as a sailor was captured by the pirate Jean Lafitte and taken prisoner. And the claim, which is not implausible in terms of the events of the day, is that Hugh Glass's choice was either to join the pirates as a crew member and become a pirate himself, or be killed. Glass decided to become a pirate, served as a pirate for a period of time with Jean Lafitte before eventually escaping to the wilds, the then very wilds of Texas, and actually making his way on foot all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to St. Louis. So that's what is claimed to be the true story of Hugh Glass, even before the events in the Revenant. So if half of it is true, he's a pretty amazing guy.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say. So, back in the day when the Revenant first came out, and you and I were talking about it, we talked about it a few times. But I remember when you sold the movie rights, and then we didn't hear about the movie for quite a long time. Exactly. Yeah.
Actually,
to the point where I felt uncomfortable asking you about it. What happened there?
Well, a lot, and not very much for long periods of time. One thing in terms of expectations, I have a really good agent that helped sell the book and sell the film rights. And one of the things that she told me at the very beginning of the process that was helpful in setting expectations is that it's exciting when a book gets optioned for a film, but the statistics are about 1 out of 3 books that is optioned actually is ever turned into a movie. And so I knew I was excited about it, but I also was fairly realistic that the odds were against it. And as the years passed and then really passed, I just kind of came to the conclusion that my book was one of the 2 out of 3 that was not going to get made. And it was a fun experience just to have it optioned, because I would periodically hear rumors that some famous actor was reading it and considering playing the role of Hugh Glass, or some prominent director was considering it. And that's fun because I love movies, and it felt like I had a bit of a connection to that world. But I had pretty much given up on it ever actually turning into a movie. So when, after 13 years, I heard that DiCaprio was going to star in the movie, first of all, I was a little bit skeptical and jaded after some experience, but then they exercised the option, which is when they actually put the money up, which is a not insignificant event. And that's when I started to feel like it actually was really going to happen. And once DiCaprio was attached in a meaningful way, things then did start to move a lot more quickly. And then it got pretty exciting. For one thing, it's about the only thing I've ever done in my career that my kids were genuinely excited about, I have to say. So there was that.
They weren't excited about going to Geneva?
Not at all, because they didn't want to move away from their friends in Montana. So they were very unhappy about the Geneva gig.
All right, well, let's talk about the movie, because if anybody has both seen the movie and read the book, there are some really significant changes from the book to the movie. And considering that it's an actual historical figure that you're writing about, the movie's, a lot of it is contrary to the actual history. For one, of course, in the movie, Hugh Glass has a son who was killed, and that seems to be a big part of his motivation for revenge. How did these changes come about, and how did you feel about them as they were being written in the script?
Well, it's another one where I think expectations are important, and I guess I was not surprised that Hollywood was going to make a lot of changes to the story. One interesting anecdote that I think is insightful about the book industry versus the film industry is a book contract, and you'll appreciate this as a lawyer, Basil. A book contract is basically about 6 pages long, and the whole thing essentially says they can't change a word without your permission. A movie contract is about 60 pages long, and basically the whole thing says they can change anything they want without your permission. So being a good lawyer, I had read that 60-page contract before I signed it, and I certainly knew that to expect that they were going to make some changes. Beyond that, I also, having been a fan of film for a long time, had a pretty clear sense going in that my sort of sensibility about historical accuracy is different than Hollywood's. And without destroying the ending for anybody who might not have seen it, the ending of my book is historically plausible given what's known about the history versus the ending of the movie that's quite fictionalized. And so I also wasn't surprised about the ending of the movie because there is something called a Hollywood ending. And there's a reason that Hollywood endings exist. And the reason for that is I think producers of films have a belief that the best way to make a commercially successful movie is to conform in a fairly strict way with an audience's expectations about story. And so I was not surprised that the film ended up with the good guy rolling around on the ground with the bad guy, and the good guy, hacking the bad guy to pieces. In the case of the movie, almost literally. Mm-hmm. So I would be naive if I would say that I was shocked at that. At a couple of junctures in the work on the film, I had an opportunity to comment on the script, and I made my pitch for historical accuracy, and they listened politely and then did what they wanted to do.
All right. Well, the one good thing is that it turned your book from, a modest success into a bestseller.
Well, modest success is a generous treatment, Basil. I can tell you're my friend. What the movie did is prior to the movie, very few people who had read the book who were not either my friends or my relatives or my mom's friends. After the movie, strangers read my book, which was fun. So you won't find me complaining about the movie in any serious way because it turns out that having DiCaprio make a film based on your book is a really good way to promote the book.
Well, speaking of being able to promote the book and promote the movie, you couldn't do any of that.
No.
Preparing for today, looking at articles, there's all these things out there, author of the Revenant, totally silent. Tell our audience about why that was. Well,
there are rules, and in the Obama administration, we took these rules very seriously. I won't do too much opinionating about other administrations, but there are rules that if you work for the federal government, you can't do anything that would use your official position for private benefit. And so, since I was in the government in a political position, I was not allowed to go out and give interviews or seek press opportunities about the Revenant. And again, that's something I knew when I went into the administration. I didn't know that a movie was going to get made, but I certainly was aware that these rules were in place, and that was part of the deal. And so because of those rules, I was not able to promote the book. After waiting all those years for something to happen, I was kind of relegated to the position of sitting on the sideline and seeing what happened as the book kind of took on its own life. And fortunately, and books are kind of interesting this way. They do kind of take on their own life apart from, as the author, you sort of put them out there. But in the case of this one, I mean, honestly, I doubt that I would have done anything to promote the book that would have been more effective than having DiCaprio star in the movie. So they probably were just the rules were probably just saving me from embarrassment of promoting it myself ineffectively.
Well, I like the story that your wife and children were at the world premiere, and you were where?
Well, I was at a trade negotiation in Africa. Yeah, so that was a little bit disappointing, but I did receive permission to attend the Academy Awards and the Golden Globes ceremony. I wasn't able to talk there, not that I was asked to, but I did get to go to the Academy Awards and to the Golden Globes with my wife. So that was a fun experience as a lifelong film buff.
That's great. Well, let's talk about the new book that's coming out. It's due out next summer.
Yeah, in July.
It's called Ridgeline.
That's right.
Tell us what it's about.
So, as I said, I love stories that are based on underlying true events. And this, like The Revenant, is historical fiction. It's based in the Powder River Valley of Wyoming in the 1860s during the Indian Wars. And it's mostly based about a famous battle that took place called the Fetterman Fight in 1866. And the months that preceded that battle, which at the time was one of the most famous battles in American history. It sort of became overshadowed 10 years later when the Battle of Little Bighorn took place. But for a period of time, it was one of the most famous battles in U.S. history. It's got a great cast of historical characters, including Red Cloud, Crazy Horse. One of the fun things from my standpoint, when I started doing research on this incident, is Jim Bridger, who, for people who have read The Revenant, is one of the two people that abandoned Hugh Glass, the character played by Will Poulter in the movie The Boy. He shows up in real life as a 66-year-old man. At that point in his career, he's a famous mountain man scouting for the U.S. Army. So it had a great kind of historical cast. And like The Revenant, there's a lot of mystery around the actual event. There's a group of U.S. soldiers that ride over a ridgeline. I won't reveal too much, but a dramatic battle ensues. And the historical record about that battle is spotty and incomplete. And so I felt like it was a perfect ground for historical fiction, much like I talked about with The Revenant.
Excellent. And at the center of this is this Colonel Henry Carrington, correct?
Yeah.
He seems like a fascinating.
So, he is a fascinating character. He is sort of a good example of somebody who was very ill-suited for his job. He was a Union officer during the Civil War and a Ivy League educated scholar, very smart guy. But in the Civil War, he was a logistics guy. He was never fired a shot in battle or even marched into battle. And then after the Civil War, all of a sudden, he's sent to lead this group of U.S. soldiers into the Powder River Valley, which was far and away the most dangerous place on the continent at that time. And he ends up in the middle of a war and is woefully equipped for that job. So he's an interesting character to have it as one of the people in the center of this. His junior officers, by contrast, are all grizzled veterans of the combat veterans of the Civil War, and they were quite dismissive in many ways of their commanding officer. And there's an interesting story about just the tension within the U.S. Army as the tension mounts over the course of the fall of 1866, and the Army is subject to repeated guerrilla-style attacks from the Lakota and Cheyenne that are in the Powder River Valley. All of that builds and culminates to the finale, which I won't give away.
All right. And so that's one part of the equation. On the other part of the equation, you have, Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, who are they kind of foils of each other? Would you say? Is that a fair?
No, I wouldn't describe them as foils. They're both in their own right fascinating historical characters, and I think among the most important figures in American history. At this juncture, and they're both known today, if you read the top line of Wikipedia, as kind of great chiefs and great leaders. And what's interesting to me about this particular moment is Red Cloud is in his 40s in 1866, and at that stage in his life is a great leader and a great chief, and really is the force behind a brilliant strategy that the Lakota devised to fight this invasion of their land. Crazy Horse, throughout the course of his life, becomes a great leader and a great chief, but at this stage in 1866, he's quite young. He's in his 20s, and he's known as being a warrior and a great warrior, but he's not yet a great leader. He's much younger in his life at this point, and so they really play different roles over the course of this time frame. Red Cloud much more as the person with the strategic vision, and Crazy Horse much more responsible for the tactical, day-to-day, week-to-week fighting.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Now, the only stuff I know about it is what you can read in the blurbs, and it seems like there's also a little backdrop into the U.S. Army at the time, is that we're right off the Civil War, and so you have people in the Army who were on both, either side of that contest, and so there's a lot of tension within the Army. Is that right? Is that a fair statement?
That's absolutely right. It's a fascinating moment because it's right after the end of the Civil War, and in fact there are soldiers serving with Colonel Carrington's army who are what they called galvanized Yankees. And galvanized Yankees were Confederate soldiers who were taken prisoner during the Civil War, and given the option of, instead of going to prison, they could renounce the Confederacy, join the Union Army, and go serve on the Western frontier. There was a shortage of Union soldiers on the Western frontier during the Civil War. And so the U.S. Army decided that they would create this category, or this mechanism for Confederate prisoners of war to basically leave the Civil War theater behind, go out and serve as Union soldiers on the frontier. You can imagine that was not necessarily an arrangement that resulted in a great sense of loyalty and affiliation. And particularly then, when you had those quote unquote galvanized Yankees, or just former Confederate soldiers who also joined the Union Army after the war, serving literally shoulder to shoulder, side by side with men that they might have fought against only 2 years earlier across the battle lines of the Civil War. So it's a fascinating moment in U.S. Army history. You combine that with terrible pay, the fact that they're getting picked apart by Lakota, Cheyenne attacks. And on top of all that, there was a gold rush going on. That's the whole reason that the Army was out there in the first place, was to defend this road from Fort Laramie up to the gold fields of Montana. So there's this lure of gold only a couple 100 miles away. And so massive incentives from all sorts of ways for these soldiers to desert. So there's an interesting dynamic throughout the story of of Red Cloud really pulling the Lakota and other tribes together at the same moment that the U.S. Army behind the walls of this fort are kind of coming apart.
Well, it sounds great, and I was the Revenant doesn't really deal with this so much, but this book seems to, where you're talking about a historical event, and the backdrop, the societal backdrop is so important to it. And we were talking about Fire and Brimstone earlier, which is about this terrible mine fire, copper mine. And one of the most interesting things about it is the societal backdrop that's going on at the time as well. So if you can tell, discuss, at least let the readers know what Fire and Brimstone is all about.
So Fire and Brimstone is about the worst hard rock U.S. mining disaster in U.S. history. And you guys are in coal country, so soft rock means coal. Hard rock, so there were coal fire disasters that were worse than this one, but this is the worst hard rock disaster. It took place in a copper mine in Butte, Montana, as Basil said, in 1917. And in that era, which is incredible to me, men were mining a mile below the surface of the ground. So they already had the technology to bore down a mile below ground and mine for copper. What happens in this disaster is there's several hundred men working below ground on this day in 1917, and a fire breaks out actually between where the men are working and the surface, and they face this horrible situation where they have to try to make it to the surface with the fire burning between them and the surface, and over 160 men were killed over the course of a week-long disaster. So there's a great adventure story there, just about what was happening to these miners and how some of them managed to survive. And as I said, I was able to go back in the historical archives and do research and piece together what was happening with different groups of men below ground and what they were thinking, what they were saying to each other, the decisions that they made that resulted in survival for some and death for others. So that already was, to me, a compelling story. But as somebody who loves politics, what really convinced me to marry myself to this story and write a book about it is the politics on the surface of that era are just fascinating. And Butte, Montana, that a lot of people outside of Montana haven't heard of, is one of the most fascinating political towns in America. It's really the place where you can make a strong argument that the birth of the American labor movement took place in this town as a result of the unionization of the copper mining industry. It had electric street lights in Butte, Montana before New York City did, because of the wealth that was there around silver mining and later copper mining. So it's this fascinating place. And as Basil, as you mentioned, this disaster breaks out right on the eve of World War I. And I was fascinated to learn about the degree of the ethnic conflict in Montana, which people think of as being very monolithic. And today it's probably more monolithic than it certainly was in 1917. But to give you a sense of Butte, Montana in 1917, the no smoking signs at the mine shafts were written in 17 languages to account for the ethnicity of the miners at that time. And of course, most of those were coming from Europe. Europe was at war, and that conflict was transposed very much to American communities where that ethnic mix existed, including Butte.
It's funny because I am actually from coal country in eastern Pennsylvania. And you mentioned Butte with the streetlights. Scranton, which is the town right up next, is known as the Electric City because they were, as a coal, boom town, had that kind of. You mentioned the World War I going on. It actually had been going on. It's just the U.S.'s involvement was on the brink. So that had been a debate that was raging, and in different ethnicities, of course, taking different sides based on what their heritage was. The description of Butte reminded me a lot of how my town was. You have the draft riot that was going on at the time.
So literally 2 days before this fire breaks out, there's a there's an anti-draft riot that takes place in Butte, Montana, that's put down by the National Guard, and the National Guard was camped at Butte because they were worried about anti-war violence in this strategic place, namely Butte, because of the copper. And so this anti-draft riot was put down by the National Guard, and there were quite a few civilians that were actually bayoneted as part of that anti-draft riot. So all of that was happening even before this disaster breaks out. After the fire breaks out, this massive strike takes place because of the obvious danger that these miners were placed in with very little regard for their safety. And then Butte turns into this national scale strike with people coming in from all over the country on both sides, and that plays out. So there's just, I was amazed at the depth and the richness of the political events that were happening in this town that, as I said, a lot of people outside of Montana don't think about that way.
Yeah. Well, and that one is a straight history, not fictionalized, correct?
It's straight history. I mean, I try and tell history in a narrative way that is engaging and fun to read, and that's a story where if you can't tell that in a fun way, then in an engaging way, then you should stop writing. But no, that book is straight nonfiction.
All right. And so is The Last Stand. The book
That's right.
Yeah. Which is about this historical figure, George Bird Grinnell.
Right.
Okay, so why him? What about him made him a subject that you wanted to devote a book to?
So George Bird Grinnell is somebody who I'd never heard of before I started looking for a subject for a new book. And I had initially had the idea of writing a story about the history of the buffalo. And specifically, I was going to write about the history of the West through the prism of the buffalo, because I thought it would be an interesting way to tell the story of the West in prehistoric times, the Native American West before the arrival of the whites. I thought it'd be an interesting way to talk about the fur trade, and then about the kind of the birth of the conservation movement, all through the prism of the buffalo. So I was doing research on a book like that when I came across this guy named George Bird Grinnell, who is this epic 19th century personality who ends up being, in my view, the person who is most responsible for the fact that the buffalo weren't completely wiped from the face of the planet. Also, he's a major figure in the protection of Yellowstone National Park and a major figure in the establishment of Glacier National Park. He's sort of Teddy Roosevelt's, he's one of the people who most influenced Teddy Roosevelt, who obviously goes on to have his own storied career as an environmentalist. So he's a fascinating personality, and he has all these different, almost Forrest Gump-like aspects of his life in terms of the different people that he meets as somebody who's out on the West in the second half of the 19th century.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't make the Forrest Gump connection, but I did know, he runs in with Custer, Wild Bill Cody, grew up near John James Audubon.
John James Audubon. Just, he bumps into everybody. And part of that is a reflection of the fact that the West in that era there weren't very many, it was a big landmass, but there weren't that many people out here. And the number of places where they congregated were relatively small. So it's not so surprising that somebody who spent 30 years in the West in that era would meet other prominent Westerners of that era. So it's not that surprising, but it does make for a good story.
Yeah. How do you go about, you mentioned you were looking around for a subject for a book. What's that process like for you? How do you know a subject is a good one from one that is a bad one, and one that there's going to be enough to write about?
Yeah. Well, the common denominator for all my books is the West, and especially the 19th century West. I dabble in the early 20th century with Fire and Brimstone, but a lot of the backstory of Fire and Brimstone is the story of mining in the 19th century West. So I love Western stories. I love adventure stories. That's just kind of the story I've always been drawn to since I was a little boy. But I also love stories that I feel like have richness and depth to them that is relevant for us today as readers. And so if you take a story like the story about Georgesburg Grinnell and the buffalo, it's hard to read about Georgesburg Grinnell's effort to save the buffalo from extinction and not think about efforts today to fight against climate change. And yet, one thing I like about historical stories is in some ways, because they took place a long time ago, there's an opportunity to have a conversation and have a starting point where people are more open-minded than they are if you start with a really controversial contemporary topic. And I think that's particularly important, frankly, in the era that we live in, where we're so divided in terms of our politics now. Unfortunately, we've gotten to the place where it's really hard a lot of times to have a reasonable conversation about a contemporary political topic with somebody who starts off disagreeing with us. And so one thing I like about historical stories is in some ways it's an easier way to wade into a controversial topic that still allows us to kind of hopefully get around then to issues that are quite important today.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting, in The Last Stand, that you write that there's at one point 30 million buffalo out in the West, and it was, by the end, it was, down to like 12. And that this movement was really the first conservation movement or environmental movement in our country. So that does provide a great historical context to not just what we're facing now, but the conservation movements we've had since then.
Well, it's a great story from that standpoint, as far as I'm concerned, and it also was very instructive about the coalition that Georgesburg Grinnell put together, which was founded, by the way, on hunters. And that's something that I think sometimes is surprising to people who don't live in the part of the world where hunting is common. But where I live, hunters and sportsmen are really the foundation of a lot of important environmental movements. And that open-mindedness to broad coalitions, to me, is one of the most important things for all of us to think about today, whatever cause it is that we're wanting to promote. I think an open-mindedness to broad-based coalitions is a good starting point for actually getting things done.
All right. I'm going to turn to some questions here. I'm a little late getting to them. We have one from your editor, Philip Turner, who asks what your next novel is about. We've already discussed that. Well, he's already plugging you.
Hey, Philip.
Philip also asks, can you talk, if you already haven't, about when you worked as a reenactor while a teenager at the historic site in the West? I think there are pictures of that.
Well, thank you, Philip. That's it's great to hear from you. Well, as actually one of the most important professional training experiences I had, certainly with relevance to this new book, is I had a job in high school and college working for the National Park Service, doing what they call living history interpretation. And as a 19, 20-year-old boy, this was the greatest job on the planet. I dressed up every day in a 1876 cavalry uniform and talked to tourists about the history of the American West. We fired a vintage cannon twice a day. I baked bread in a wood-burning vintage U.S. Army oven using the recipe that was first used in the U.S. Army during the War of 1812. Got to do all these things that are about as close as you can get in the then 20th century to experiencing life in the 19th century. And it certainly had a massive impact on me, and frankly provided for lots of interesting details. I mean, understanding what that wool uniform feels like in a hot Wyoming summer is something that is best experienced first person.
Well, we have Eileen who asks, and this is about the Revenant, and it's a great question because it's really quite a dilemma that these folks faced at the time. Why was Hugh Glass abandoned? Did they think he would die, or did they just not like him?
So my theory in the book is there's some historical evidence that the two men who stayed with him were paid to stay back and take that risk, but under the understanding that Hugh Glass was going to die, and after a couple of days of hanging out with him, he would die. They would give him a decent burial, and then they would hurry to catch up with their comrades who had gone ahead. There's no question that these men were at risk because of Hugh Glass's injury. It slowed them down. They were in dangerous country. It was important for them to move and to keep moving quickly. So at one level, you can imagine why they would do what they did. Namely, most of them would go on. They would hire a couple people to stay back. What I think was ultimately the most significant quandary is that when Hugh Glass didn't die, these guys who stayed back got more than they bargained for. They were probably thinking they'd take the risk of staying there for a couple of days, and all of a sudden it was taking a lot longer than that, and he wasn't dead. The kind of moral quandary that I really focus on in the book is not the fact that they abandoned him. And in fact, I later try and put Hugh Glass himself in a situation where he faces that same quandary, and he makes a somewhat similar decision. But what I think probably really enraged Hugh Glass and for the frontier was the real crime, was the fact that they robbed him of the possessions that might have given him a chance to survive on his own. So the fact that they not only abandoned him, but also took his rifle was, to me, what probably in the context of those times was what would have been viewed as the true crime, not the abandonment itself, but the robbery.
Edward asks, in the times of the Revenant, no one appears to become infected, no matter the injury. Was the folk medicine that effective?
No, I suspect that a lot more. Hugh Glass somehow managed not to die despite what had to have been massive infection. And in the book, I certainly have him suffering from infection and still surviving. Look, I think it's a great question, and it points out the fact that the movies get made about the dramatic ways that people died in that era, like getting killed by the Arikara or mauled by a grizzly or falling off a cliff. But I think I'm certain that far more people died because they, had some cut that became infected and they couldn't treat. Fur trappers who broke an ankle and couldn't treat it effectively and therefore became handicapped and were unable to hunt in the way that they needed to hunt to survive. I have a feeling that those very pedestrian day-to-day types of injuries killed a lot more people than the ones that get made in the movies.
Excellent. Here's another one from Eileen. Do you know of any females who lived a life somewhat like Hugh Glass?
I'm not as familiar with female characters who were fur trappers. They almost certainly existed. There are all sorts of fascinating female characters that we associate with other eras of Western history. There were certainly lots of Native American women who are a part of the fur trade era, but I'm not aware of someone who there are books written about, for example, that give a very good perspective aside from Native Americans in that era.
All right. So we talked about Ridgeline that's going to be released in the summer. Do you have a project after that you already have in mind?
Well, I'm doing some work right now to try and get traction with Ridgeline as the basis for a scripted television series. And one fun piece of news: a couple of weeks ago, Ridgeline was optioned by the same company, Anonymous Content, that produced The Revenant. So I'm doing some work on that, and certainly hope we get traction there, and that Ridgeline will turn into a kind of a high quality scripted television series. So that's kind of my main focal point right now. In the meantime, I'm still looking for sort of the next news story, and I've not found anything yet that I'm married to.
All right. Well, let me take you a little bit off the topics we've been been discussing so far. What's it like getting a call from the President of the United States asking you to be an ambassador?
Well, full disclosure, I did not actually get a call from Obama offering me that job. It was a much more drawn out process, and I did get a call from a guy named Ron Kirk, who was his cabinet secretary responsible for trade. That was an exciting call. Although I will say that whole process of going through congressional confirmation hearings and all of that is extended and relatively painful. And they do a pretty good job of always kind of making you feel like there may be just one more hoop to jump through before you can kind of have that ticker tape moment. So there were some exciting calls with kind of interim success along the way in terms of getting the offer to be considered, and then hearing that the vote had finally taken place, that I had been confirmed, but they were significantly more anticlimactic than I might have expected or hoped.
Well, I think we're gonna have to.
And in the end, it's a little bit more of an endurance race, and you're just so tired that I was just happy that I'd been confirmed.
Well, I think someday we're going to have a program devoted just where you tell us about what's on the wall behind you. There seems like there's a lot of artifacts back down there. All right, I'm going to ask you a final question. It's going to be, I apologize in advance because it's one you're going to be totally unprepared for. If you had to give advice to these four knuckleheads, what would it be? This is our graduation day, so I thought that'd be fun.
That is hilarious. That is very funny. I guess hopefully we're still recognizable.
You have hair and I have hair. I'm happy to say that.
I won't make any claims beyond that, but that is pretty funny.
Well, thanks, Mike. This has been really
thanks, Basil.
Tremendous pleasure to have you on.
Well, thanks to the library and to the Historical Association too. I really appreciate that you had the interest in this program, and kudos to you for providing this type of content. I hope it's something that people enjoy, especially in the context of the COVID world we're living in. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.